Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Happily Never After. I'm Kate,
And I'm Jay.
and here we're working on turning the page after spousal loss. This week, Jay, I'm really excited to talk to you about an interesting topic. We're going to talk about the shift in friends groups and social circles after losing your spouse. And I know for me that was a huge component that just compounded the loss. While Craig wasn't a social butterfly, he was the introvert and I was the extrovert. All of our friends groups were basically directly tied to him. After he died, they very quickly dissolved. What happened with you?
Very similar. What was interesting was everything that I ended up doing kind of catered around Kim's friends because we were from two different worlds. I always say Kim was a silver spoon in the mouth type of child.
Is
I was a street urchin, so it was like,
that the technical term?
and yeah, sure, why not? But when we got into college, none of that seemed to matter. But when we left college, that's all it was about. I noticed Kim's friend circle were just like Kim. They were wealthy Black people that what was interesting was I noticed that with the exception maybe one or two of her friends, the rest of them lived no more than a block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks away from where they grew up. And I
Wow.
just like my thought process was my mother lived 8 states away
Yep.
in Jersey. My father lives in Texas, and I had no familiar relationships. So I ended up gravitating to her family, her friends. For me, that kind of became a natural norm. But when she died, I clearly was shown that I was just an implant, a member, because I didn't grow up in that atmosphere.
Interesting. So there was a socioeconomic factor at play with the friends group dynamic for you. And even going to college together, you guys hadn't developed like a circle of friends together. They were all of that affluency that she came from.
Well, see, what was interesting, the school I went to Hampton University, and Hampton
Shout
was,
out to Hampton.
yo, I love Hampton. But one thing I can say about Hampton, they were a lot of the children of the more elite. They all had money. I didn't have money, and I knew how to mimic, and I knew how to be a chameleon. So that's why in college, what happened was we ended up kind of gravitating to people who were of a similar ilk to Kim.
Mm, that's a great way
And
of phrasing that.
I noticed where I was. I was literally a fish out of water, but by my own fruition. What I was doing was mimicking to fit in
Mm,
to a group instead of being myself. And
gotcha.
it took time for me to understand. When all of our friends groups decided to kind of part ways with me,
Mm,
in the beginning, I was so upset. But over time, I started realizing it was actually the best thing for me because as they decided to stay in their circle, I got out of the bubble. I got out of my comfort zone. Once I left my comfort zone, here I am talking with you. These are things that I know that the people that were associated with Kim would not do. These are the things that all would look quote unquote weird and strange. But
because it's taboo to talk about these types of things out in the open, especially in the more affluent, social circles. I feel like that's just a thing that you don't do. And maybe that's me, coming from poverty and not really understanding how things in those circles operate. But I feel like the higher up in the social class, the less taboo things you talk about. And I
and
know, so for me, I had transplanted from Massachusetts to Connecticut when I met Craig. So
okay.
I'd been in the state, 5 or 6 years, but I didn't have any like real friends. I was working full time and I was a mom and I was married. And so, yeah, I had some people that I like occasionally hung out with and people who I call my friends, but none of those like really deep, long rooted local friends. And my best friend lives in Vermont. Her and I still talk. She was, someone who I would see sporadically just because of the distance. But beyond that, like, it's not like I had, oh, hey, I'm going to go hang out with the girls on Sunday brunch, or, oh, I'm going to go hang out, with my friends, or hey, let's go hang out with my friends. Nope, we all hung out with his groups, his social groups. And he worked for the state. So we would do, like work dinners and work parties. And I would hang out with that group of people, which was, me. I was a retail person at the time and he had a government job. So that was me, trying to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, and trying
Right.
to run to catch up and, fit in and feel like I fit in. And then, if it wasn't those groups of friends, it was his social circles where he was a huge nerd and he used to facilitate a Dungeons and Dragons game night at our house every week. And so every Monday night, if the guys brought their girlfriends, it was us girls who didn't know each other and there was an age difference between us, awkwardly sitting around on our phones or like trying to hang out with the guys and feeling like I was imposing. I was the hen in the rooster house, like
Right. Right.
I tried to like play the game and get acclimated. And the guys were always nice to me and I considered them friends. And even after Craig died, like the game night, they kept it going. And obviously we didn't do it at my house anymore. They shifted it to someone else's house. And so I made the attempt to like drive and go and participate. It just got to be more triggering and more trouble than it was helpful to participate. As soon as you stop going, those relationships fall
See,
off and fall
yep.
apart. And so, like, he's no longer working there. So I don't see his work people. And again, there was an age difference between us. So it's not like they're going to really reach out. Like, 50,
Right.
40, 50, 60-year-old people aren't going to reach out to a 30-year-old and be like, hey, let's go shopping. Let's
Right.
go get brunch. Like, so that fell off. And then his other social circle fell off. And then beyond that, it was just him and I were kind of homebodies and we were content with that. And I had no one. So after the drop off happens, that we all know happens, 6, 12 weeks after they die, when everybody goes back to their normal lives and we're still ruminating in grief, I felt the bottom give out where I was just like, holy shit, I am absolutely alone. And that was a terrible feeling to have that awareness of those social circles just completely disintegrated.
Kate, let me tell you how crazy of a correlation there is between your situation and mine. The difference is Kim and I only lived about 15 minutes away from each other. I lived on the east side of town and she lived on the west side. As a matter of fact, where we lived, I lived in East Orange. She lived in West Orange. The difference between the two was night and day because I had grown up around people. We were all from the hood when I was in. As a matter of fact, let me tell you a quick funny story.
Okay.
When I first met her, and the first time we ended up going to her house, she lived in this big old house, circular driveway, cars all over the place.
Some
And I'm
Fresh Prince of Bel Air stuff,
yeah.
right?
And I'm sitting there and I cracked this joke and she looked at me like I was crazy. But
Yeah.
the joke that I cracked was I was like, is your mom and dad like the maids here? Maid butler? She was like, no, it's my house. I was like, this is your house? I was like, wow, you could fit 20 people in her house, 20 people that I knew. And then what was I started getting that mentality in my head. I was too good to be back in East Orange.
Mm,
And in reality, what I didn't understand, East Orange made me. I was privileged to be able to understand West Orange in that area.
mm.
You
There's an
know,
appreciation that comes from it when you
yeah.
don't have that.
And it wasn't until the friends group decided to literally, it was interesting because I have a friend that is a therapist. I was explaining to him about how everybody just abandoned me. And his comment to me was, you've been kicked out the nest.
Mm.
Two choices. You can either hit the ground or you can learn to fly. What are you going to do? Then he said this. He said, understand this. When you get kicked out the nest and you choose to fly, he goes, guess what? All the people that were your friends are still sitting there with their mouth open, waiting for their mother to put a worm in it.
Mm.
And he was like, now you're out there looking for your own worms. He was like, understand, getting quote unquote kicked out really became a benefit to you. Now you have to see this as a benefit to you. And I spent a long time milling that over. Your emotions are in it because emotionally, I was like, I had been with these people for 25 years of my life.
And it's
And
hard not to get angry, after that much time and like what you think is your friend, and then for them to just completely abdicate, like
yeah,
to just like disappear like that.
and this is one thing that I want to say to the audience. You can make the choice to be upset. And if you do that, then that's going to put you in a situation emotionally you're going to be constantly wondering what is wrong with you.
Mhm.
To say that you're the one that's broken. You do have to look at yourself. What I had to do was face what I consider reality and realize I had spent my time being a chameleon. I needed to realize I was so busy changing to fit someone else's mold. I didn't understand where I was.
You didn't
And
know who you were.
I had no idea. This gives an opportunity to discover who you are. I tell the audience, like I said, don't be upset when you are ousted from a circumstance. Take the time to understand the difference between what I call alone and lonely. A-
Yes. There's a
al-
huge difference between those 2, and you have to get really comfortable with being alone and
yeah,
practice, repetitive practice. I still have to practice being alone and being, content filling my own cup.
yes.
And that doesn't mean I'm lonely. I enjoy my own
Right.
company.
Right.
And, there's that huge, you know, societal, cultural, like, oh, you can't love until you love yourself. It's twisted from the essence of once you can fill your own cup and you don't look for that outward validation from people, you tend to have a better understanding of who you are intrinsically and have better, more authentic, healthier relationships, socially, romantically, independently. That's better when you learn how to fill your own cup and sustain being alone. And that's
Because
hard in the early days of grief.
let me tell you something though. Over time, you learn to become your own best friend.
Yes.
And that's the difference.
And
See,
that makes you more like viable. Like I've
right,
actually found that people want to be my friend or want to get to know me more authentically because I'm not coming from that place of insecurity, desperation, and
right,
trauma.
right,
The other piece of it is a lot of the times people just don't know how to interact with our grief, right? So they take a step back from us socially because they don't want to trigger us, they don't want to make us uncomfortable, they just don't know how to interact with our grief. And they're also grieving the person we used to be
yeah,
because we've had this traumatic experience of losing our spouse, and the version of who we were as a spouse can no longer exist, right? Like we're not that person anymore. We are chemically, biometrically changed, and
right.
they want that person back. And that's a lot of the times why people are like, oh, they wouldn't want you to be sad, or they feed you those platitudes because they want you to get back to being that person as soon as possible because they don't know how to handle, or they don't know this version of you. And maybe it's that they don't mesh well with this version of you, or they don't think about, even if it's subconsciously, they don't think that they'll get to know you well enough or enjoy you well enough, and they just feel that change and that rift, and they then step back and abdicate and remove themselves, which can be really hard. But it comes back to what you were saying about not taking it personally, which I know is really hard to do. It doesn't mean that you're broken or that there's something wrong with you if people choose to take a step back from you. One of the hardest things I think was understanding that it is just a natural part of the grief process after losing your spouse, is that your
Absolutely.
social circle is going to change, if not completely erode, and that's okay.
You said something earlier, but this is important. Remember, the friend circle that knew you as a couple now is having a very difficult time processing you being out of that couple zone that they're familiar with. So that triggers them in a way of reminiscing of what was.
Yes.
They can't see you moving on because you moving on means that you've abandoned the old world that everyone is accustomed to. Even though you're not abandoning the old world, you are growing. They don't want to see it as growth. We have this tendency to look at the negative side of circumstance.
And we're creatures of habit, right? Like, so any change or disruption is unnerving. And when you say they don't want, I want to make sure that we're clear. It's not a conscious, like, malintent. Like, our
Oh,
social circles, I put in air quotes, friends, they don't necessarily consciously, cognitively, actively seek us to suffer. Subconsciously, there's a pushback and a resistance to that shift and that growth. And in the back of their minds, there's that, like, what if they bring a new person in, and that's a shift to the social circle, and it's protecting the sanctity of the social circle and the dynamic that already works and exists. And especially like in our cases where they were social circles tied to our loved one, it's an assault almost on that loved one for bringing either a new person in or bringing you in independently. It's like a flat tire, a a jalopy wheel. It's got that weird ka-thunk ka-thunk as it rolls the road, if you know what I mean. It just doesn't roll the same way anymore. So it's
Absolutely.
completely natural for them to have that shock and that resistance to it. It just always catches me off guard when people talk about like how upset it makes them. And I have to remember that I was that upset because there's that drop off, like I said, but everyone's like, oh, well, let me know if you need anything, or I'm here if you need something. And then when you do finally break down and ask, because we all have that one thing that we finally
Oh,
break down and ask, and nobody's there,
they're not there. Right.
all of the people who said let me know if you need something, when you really do, like in 0 hour, your darkest time, we've all been there, and you reach out privately or in a group and you're like, hey, like, this is, I am capsizing, I need help. And they all go, oh, sorry, I've got plans, or oh, that's like, Christmas card picture day, or I'm out of town, or, and even if those are legitimate reasons, it's the way in which they respond that just makes you even further like the
Yeah.
bottom has been
Yeah.
pulled out and
Yeah.
isolated and alone. So it's like, don't go to the trouble of telling me you're going to be there if you're not actually going to be there, first of all. But I had to like really remember and remind myself and remind people that I work with, don't expect help. Don't
Yep.
expect it. Even if people say they're going to be there, even if they offer it, it's like a contract. Nothing is in motion until the paper is signed. So unless they are there hands on helping you, don't expect it. But
And
be grateful when you get it, because
realize
the people who do show up actually see what you're going through, and actually they may not completely empathize, but they can at least understand that for you to ask for help or for you to be going through what you're going through, they can like access your pain and share that journey with you. Be grateful when you get it, but do not expect anybody to be there.
And you know what, Kate? The hard thing is to not expect people to be there. Like you said, after they said they would, there is no cavalry coming. There is no one that's going to offer you the help you need.
For those widows out there, you are no princess. You do not need
Yeah.
saving. You are a queen. So fix your crown and get to work, girl.
Same thing with the widowers. Gentlemen, when you're out here, understand, born alone, die alone. And it sucks. But it's a reality. You are. I want to say this again. You can be your best friend. You will learn so much about yourself, especially when you have faced the feelings of abandonment, the emotional feelings.
Because
Un-
widowhood absolutely
yeah,
creates that feeling. And then if you have any kind of previous trauma or childhood trauma, it just amplifies and exacerbates that.
it really does. I need to say this ends up being a interesting point where you now can look at yourself and say, what strength do I have in this circumstance? And start to use it. And then you have to realize everyone is going to look at you differently. So when you decide to go left while everybody else is going right, they're going to be like, he or she is crazy for going left. You have to be okay with hearing that.
Yes,
Because, and here's another thing, it represents change.
which is
That
evolution.
I was going to say, which is growth. The reality of that situation is growth, evolution, it's going to come with pain.
They don't call them growing pains
Right.
for no reason.
And a big part of that pain is the fact that you're going to have to move on from certain familiar relationships. Understand that they are not bad people. It's just that you have now outgrown them
It took a
because,
long time for
right.
me to understand that whole some people are reasons, some people are seasons
Yep.
philosophy.
Yep.
Because while they were your friend for 20 years, it doesn't necessarily mean that they get to be your friend for 20 more years. And it's just a really hard thing to process. The other component of that actually someone brought to my attention, and it's someone who, I'm really sad to say that I'm not really friends with anymore. And they were a person who I had highly regarded as intrinsic to my initial grief journey. I was called on the carpet by them, where they're like, you know what? Like, you're a really shitty friend lately. And I got offended by that. And I got really angry. And I was like, what do you mean? Excuse me? Like, I just lost my husband. Like, and they kind of were like, grief gives you permission to act any way you need to
Yep.
move unapologetically, but it does not remove the accountability you have for those choices that you make. And I went, oh, and I had to sit with that for a second and like take that back and, let that marinate for a while.
It's
I was
true.
really thinking about it that I was like, you're right. Like I kind of acted unapologetically, but I made waves. There were wakes in the aftermath of my unapologeticness,
But you know
and
what?
weren't great choices, and I'm accountable for them. So I
And
actually
you're
went back to
right.
her and had to apologize. I was like, you're right. I was a really shitty friend, and I can't undo that. And I understand if you don't want to be my friend anymore as a result. And in turn, it appears that that's the case, and so be it. But I at least was able to appreciate what she said, and thankfully she said it at a time where enough time had passed, well over a year since Craig's passing, where I was able to hear it and process it and appreciate it, because that's not an easy thing to hear, where
No.
we
And
immediately go into that defensive of like, what do you mean I was a shitty friend? I just lost my husband.
you expected
Oh,
them to understand you, but
and to just allow and allow and allow. And
yep,
I always say, you are allowed, like, you get to move unapologetically. Grief is an excuse to just be a dick sometimes, right? Like, you get to say those boundaries and you get to hold those places and you get to do all of that stuff, but that does not absolve you of the accountability that comes with choosing to act unapologetically. Be
listen,
aware of that.
what's interesting about all of that is the fact that you have to start within yourself and you have to start to begin to understand that the changes are going to happen, the circumstances are going to shift, and you have to, like you said, look within yourself and understand that maybe you are taking things out of context.
Mm,
Don't get me wrong. The other party is only doing what they know.
that's right.
You are the one, because the circumstance has happened to you, you are the one that has to look at things differently. Yes, it's not fair. It's not fair because you're like, well, how come if I had to change, how come they're not changing? Well, they're not changing because this circumstance did not happen to them,
Hmm.
it happened to you. And because it happened to you, it means that change has to come within you. Then you have to be okay if they made choice not to change or not to recognize your change.
Yes.
I had a good I had a I he's still a good friend. He was from the neighborhood. We actually didn't get cool until after I went to college. He's still one of my great friends. What's interesting though is he doesn't see my world the way I thought he would. But that's because
Mm,
A, he's married, he's got kids. He knew my wife, he was friends with my wife too. It's like these shifts, these changes. It's funny because I remember he sent me a text and he was like, "Man, I was listening to this guy on YouTube. He sounds just like you." And I'm like, okay, but he doesn't understand that because he's not subject to that. And because he's not subject to that, it seems strange. And I knew what he was getting at because what he was getting at was like, man, you've gone so left of center that I don't even know you anymore. And he was right. He doesn't know me. We're still friends, but he doesn't know the things that I've had to go through. He doesn't know the things that have happened. He doesn't know that there are things that he has done to force me to see our relationship differently.
mm,
I can't bring that to him because if I bring it to him, then I'm the wrong person, not him, because everybody else sees it his way. So put it this way. And there's something I learned about life. If everyone else sees it different than you, then there's maybe something about you. You know
yeah.
what I'm saying? It's not, it can't be, all these people can't be wrong, or all these people can't see your difference. You not expect to understand that something different has caused you to become a changed version of yourself, a 2.0 version. And the fight is constantly you looking to go back to the way things were, you being forced to have to move forward. I made this analogy. The audience they're not going to be able to see it, but it's like putting your arm out, your right arm out, and your left leg back, representing that there are two doors.
Mm,
You're using your right arm to keep your door of the future open, but yet you're using your left leg to keep your door of the past open. And either way, you're not moving because
interesting.
you have to make a commitment. And that commitment is, do you close the door of the future
Mm,
or do you close the door of the past? Because you either have to walk forward or you have to move backward. The big part of that is asking yourself, which one are you ready to do?
yes.
For people dealing in grief, you have to release your left leg. You have to,
Mm,
and you don't want to, but you have to. There is a difference between reminiscing over the past
remember. Yep.
and feeling that you need to be back and a part of it. You can't be a
Staying
part of it
stuck in
anymore.
it. Yeah. Staying stuck
No,
in it is different
right.
than having appreciation for and remembering. And some of letting go of those social circles, you know, is part of that letting your left leg go. You
Yes,
have to be okay with, we as widows and widowers go through so much transition. We lose so much. The number of secondary losses we have with spouse loss, and not to say that this type of loss is better than any other type of loss, or better in air quotes, worse than any other type of loss, but we have the loss of identity, we have the loss of financial security, the loss of our house, probably our family dynamic, our friend circle, and then to have this moment where we're forced to be catapulted into self-discovery where we're lost from our comfort, and it is a lot to undertake, but the only way out is through. You know, a 500
absolutely.
mile walk into the woods is a 500-mile walk out.
All time. Yep.
And you have to take that step into releasing those friend groups that are no longer conducive to appreciating the relationships you had if they're no longer functional, you know, having gratitude for them and then letting them go and being open to the new friends that you find. Like, I think about if I had stayed stuck in those social circles, I never would have met you, Jay.
Absolutely.
Like, you and I wouldn't have crossed paths, and you're probably one of my best friends right now. Like, I think that you and I have
We
really
mesh.
come to like get
We
to know each
fully
other.
mesh.
And I
Yes.
think it's really beyond just the shared experience that we have. The more we get to know each other as people, there's a real connectedness that we wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to learn about.
And that's
You
true.
you open yourself up once you do that self-discovery and that, you know, forced alone time where you learn to fill your own cup, and then you open yourself up to these other alternative healthy relationships. You find people who really are your tribe, who will show up when you call. Like, I know if I called you at 3 in the morning, you would answer the phone and you would be like, what's shaking? Like, what do you need to talk about? And vice,
Likewise.
like, I know that there are certain people right now, 3 years out from Craig's passing, that I could, without a shadow of a doubt, say, it's go time. And they would show up
Right.
where I thought I knew that before. And not to say that those people who were in my circle before were bad people, they're great people, but people have different purposes in your lives. And not everyone is called to do the same work for the same amount of time. And the same goes for us, like the people who've let go of us. We have to be okay being let go, you know, like
Yes.
being laid off from our friendship. It's no one's going to
Yeah.
remember the important dates. No one is going to say their name the way that you do. No one is going to know the trauma and the tragedy that you've been through the way that you do. But the people who you open yourself up to having healthy relationships with are the people who will ask you, remind me their name, tell me your anniversary, tell me your story. Do you want to talk about it? Let's go get a cup of coffee. Those are the people in this second half of your life, this New Testament, if you will, that you're getting to live. Like, you really are getting a second chance at life and at your authentic self. You get a do-over.
That's exactly what it is. It's the fact you are now finding your authentic self. You're realizing the world that you were in previously, your authentic self does not fit into that world. You now have to, again, move forward. And in moving forward, like you said, you start to find members of your tribe. You start to find people that have a clearer understanding of the type of things that you have gone through. Like you said, you'll find those 3 o'clock in the morning people that you know when you're going through something, you can pick up the phone. And you thought that the people from your past were those people.
And they
But
may very well have been at that point in
at
time.
that point,
Because not to say those relationships you had were disingenuous, like, you weren't
right,
disingenuous with
right,
them. When we
right.
say you're finding your authentic self, it doesn't mean that you were disingenuous before. You were your authentic self at
At
that
that
point
time.
in time, but now you've
Right.
been forced through this evolution, and now you've had to have a rebirth. A new authentic self has developed as a result of this trauma, this tragedy, this experience. So this new authentic self doesn't fit in those past relationships the same way.
And also, you have to remember this: the past relationships that you had were based off of things in this world that you now don't have. Relationships that were in the past, couples going places, doing things as a couple. You don't have those things anymore, but
Yep.
they still do. They're not going to abandon the things that they have been accustomed to just because you no longer fit in their group. That means that they're making the choice to stay in their circumstances, not in a bad way. It just
They're still part of a couple, and it makes sense for them to stay
right,
in couple dynamics.
right. You have to be okay with understanding that you no longer fit in their group. You now have to keep your conversation surface. You now have to keep, sometimes you may have to keep your feelings out of a situation. They are not, here's the part that hurts the most. They don't have to play by the rule.
Mm.
You do.
You have to play by a different set of rules. They're going to either not invite you to things because they don't want to trigger you or make you feel
Right.
bad that it's all couples and you're the only single. They're going to assume that it's offensive to you, or they're going to invite you and then inadvertently try to set you up with other singles. The number of weddings I've now been to where I got sat at the single table. Like, the opening scene or the scene from the Adam Sandler movie, The Wedding Singer, where he's singing Love Hurts and he's going around to like all the different tables. And then there's that one table that I like to refer to as the island of misfit toys. That's the table I usually get sat at recently. And it is like such a hit to my self esteem and like just an awareness. And it just compounds the grief when I get it. Like, people don't know where else to put me. And they're trying to include me because not including me feels more offensive. It's a slippery slope for them. There's no win for them. I get it. But just understand, you either may not be invited at all and you can't be offended by that because they're trying to protect you, or they might invite you and then stick you somewhere that feels really wrong.
That extends well beyond that. I was facing this issue when I was first bringing together my concept of the grief boundary theory. I'm putting out messages on social media to people that were my friends group that I thought would relate and understand. They don't get it. I had to go outside of my social circle. I had to learn how to become uncomfortable so that I could grow.
You have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's what I've
Absolutely.
found.
I had to open the door of that comfort zone and I had to walk through it
Mm.
and I had to walk into the chaos. What I realized was walking into that chaos was the best thing for me because it allowed me to grow.
Like opening the door to a house party you've never been to. I promise. Come on in. The party's fine.
It's that type of thing. I mean, reality is it's always going to be a difficult situation when you're changing your friends group or when your friends group changes.
Mm.
I'm going to sum this up real quick and realize that just because the group that you were accustomed to has changed, it means that you are evolving, you are growing, you are getting to a different version of you. And I'm going to say a better version of you because one, you're starting to see things that others are not willing to see
Or can't see.
or can't see. No, I'm not going to say can't see, don't want to see.
Okay.
That's a different, you know what? That's a whole different story. I'm not gonna go there. But
No, I think this has been a really great conversation. And I just want to remind our listeners that grief can be really isolating. And if anyone out there is feeling incredibly lonely or is needing help, that they can call the suicide prevention hotline. In Connecticut, we do have a text availability for that number. I'm not sure if you do where you are. Actually, I think
Of
that might
course,
be a national
we have
initiative.
an impact.
What is it,
Yeah.
811, I think.
Yes.
And if it's not a severe mental health crisis, for those of you who are feeling isolated and alone, reach out to support groups on Facebook or within your community. Reach out to Jay or I, go to our websites and send us a message. We'd be happy to talk with you and connect you with resources, or just talk with you ourselves. That's not a sales plug. That's a genuine, we know what it's like and we've been there, and we don't want anyone else to have that experience. So just know that while you may be alone tangibly, you're not alone out there in the ether, and we hear you and we see you and we are available to you. So
And the one thing I want to say before we wrap everything up is understand the difference between emotional feelings and mental health related feelings.
yeah,
A loss of any type is not always a mental circumstance. Normally is an emotional feeling that can morph. There may be symptoms that are similar. You may decide to start using alcohol. You may decide to start being in certain activities. You may have these suicide ideation, but you're not going through a mental crisis. You're having a matter of the heart right now. Somebody may be able to address life coaches, ministers, people that are helping you to create forward progress.
yes.
Go from there. But I don't want to get too deep to the rabbit
We could go
hole.
all day if we tried, right?
I'm gonna say, hey, I'm Jay.
And I'm Kate, and we just really want to thank you all for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed what you heard today, make sure you check out our previous episodes and subscribe to our episodes so you can get future content with grief and gratitude. Until next time.
You've been listening to Happily Never After, part of the Exvadio podcast network. You can catch every episode of Happily Never After, as well as the rest of the network, at exvadio.com, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.